At the time of Hurricane Katrina, I held a management position at the Hyatt Hotel in downtown New Orleans. The hotel is adjacent to the Superdome, where many of the people were held for over a week until they were evacuated. Contrary to popular belief, the levees didn't break during the storm. It was the morning after that, the water came rushing into the city. I was not aware of what was being shown on TV while the city was flooded. We were too busy dealing with people trying to find safety. However, I do remember when the military contractors arrived. These men and women were something straight out of a movie. Hardcore combat-tested killing machines. We had been having a problem in the hotel with a man molesting and raping women while they were sleeping. He was breaking into rooms and doing some of the most horrible things you could imagine. The Hyatt had backup generators for the first few days of the storm that allowed people to move about with some light. But once they failed because of lack of fuel, things went straight to hell. Every hallway was dark and the stairwells were deadly. The contractors searched the hotel floor by floor and room by room until they found him. Once he was identified by two of the victims, he walked out of the side access door and we never saw him again. I won't see that they killed him, but the chances that he ran away were very slim. That same day, I went along with 3 of them to Gentilly, a section of the city where my house was. I wanted to see if I could salvage anything from my place, relatively safe and isolated from the horrors of the outdoors in the hotel. I had absolutely no idea of the real condition of the city. We had only made it about a mile from the boat when we ran into the first dead body. A young child floating in the water, not more than 12 years old. His body was bloated and swollen from the gases inside. A chunk of his leg was missing from some type of animal bite. On the rooftops were people everywhere, begging for help. One man was standing on his roof, pointing to the water. "Sharks! Sharks!" he shouted. When I looked over, I saw 3 sharks swimming down the street. We traveled further. The sounds of people asking for help to this day still torture me. A woman on the roof cried out, "Help! My baby is sick! Just take him with you!" The contractors looked at me, saying it was my decision. What was I supposed to do with the baby? I could barely feed myself. I decided to ignore her. We were passing the prison when we saw 2 men with guns elevated on the steps of the courthouse. They crouched down to hide, I guess, expecting to ambush us and take the boat. The guys I was with had a simply lit area off with gunfire. No questions, no second thoughts. For 3 minutes straight, they lit up the air. I saw the men scramble away, jumping from the steps into the war, and we sped past them in the boat. At that time, I was completely over the idea of going to my house. Screw that. We arrived at Broad Street to find bloated dead bodies floating around everywhere. The smell was nauseating. I had seen enough. I began to wonder how many people I knew that were floating around the streets, and I asked to go back. When we arrived at the hotel, I could only sit there. I cannot tell you the words to describe how the city felt. The smell of chemicals and death. Many people claim to know what disaster is, but until you live through something like that, you have no clue. Nighttime was the worst for everyone. We all tend to take for granted the simple things in life like food, clean water, and working lights. However, it is life that makes you feel safe. If you find yourself without life for an extended period of time, everything becomes frightening. The day after, I ventured out with the team of contractors. Rumors began to spread about the things happening at the Superdome, which was less than 1 block away from the hotel. Now rumors during a disaster, as I would learn later that night, should be treated as actual facts. So you have no way of knowing what's true and what's not true. We got word that there were gangs of men roaming the area of the Superdome with guns. A little unknown secret was that ammunition was scarce during Katrina. Somehow the criminals had managed to get much more ammunition to the National Guard soldiers that were there. Word was that they were going to come to the hotel and try to occupy the rooms, and this occupation was going to happen by force. So far, I have neglected to explain some things to you. You see, one face at a hotel was littered with broken windows. This was a side of the hotel that faced the corner Poitras and Loyola Ave, the east side. The western side did not have as much damage as there were other buildings to shelter the windows from the wind. So, essentially, the eastern wing of the hotel was completely unsecured and could easily be infiltrated if a person desired to. I had to meet with several of the contractors who stayed in the hotel and asked that they patrol the eastern section. They agreed to leave 2 men behind to patrol the bottom 2 floors of the eastern section. That night things were very quiet in the hotel. It was so quiet that it made me very nervous. The majority of the contractors had gone out into the night to do what they were hired to do. I choose not to share that information as I prefer not to get shot. However, there were supposed to be at least 2 men patrolling the eastern corridors, and of course, it was my job to check on them and see if they needed anything. So I mustered all the courage I could. I grabbed my 9mm and headed over to that section of the hotel. It was 11:47 p.m. I will never forget the time because the glue of my digital watch was the only thing that provided me with any light to see. Walking the dog halls of the eastern wing of the hotel was one of the most frightening things I'd done in my life. The hotel had thousands of broken windows, and the wind blew through them, creating this constant low moaning and whistling sound. That, combined with the flapping of the curtains in the windows, left me completely unnerved. In the hallway, the majority of the doors were closed, but towards the end of the hall, I knew at least 1 or 2 of them were open. I can feel a strong breeze blowing through the hallway as it creates a tunneling effect, the air pushing against my chest. Halfway down the hall, I heard one of the doors open. Again. With no light other than that from my digital watch, I began to freak out. Was it one of the contractors or someone else? Man, to be real with you, I was not just scared, I was terrified. The funny thing is, when you are truly scared, you forget that you have a weapon. The 9mm I had with me might as well have been a loaf of bread at that point. Somehow I pressed on, not wanting to see anything and alert the possible bad guys to my presence or accidentally get shot by the contractors. I just walked slowly to the end of the hall. When I got to the stairwell door, something told me, "Look behind me." I turned my head, and through the darkness I could make out 3 silhouettes slowly moving down the hallway towards me. It was not the contractors for sure. It's only 2 of them. Panicking, I quickly pushed open the door to the stairwell, and it sounded to me with this loud creaking and squeaking noise. I knew at that moment I had given my position away. So I bolted up the steps to the 2nd floor, out the door, and into the hallway. Sprinting down the hallway as fast as I could, I saw a blinding light come from ahead of me. In such darkness, that kind of light is disturbing. Then it went off. "What you running for, G?" asked one of the contractors, breathing heavily. I managed to say, "Chased, 1st floor, intruders." He whistled, and there was a reply from both ends of the hallway. Then he said, "If shit goes left, keep your head down and get into one of the rooms." By now, you can hear movement coming from the stairwell that had just exited, followed by the door slowly opening. The next few seconds were quiet as figures made their way out of the door and into the hallway. I couldn't make out everything they said, but for sure I heard them say, "We gonna find that motherfucker." After that, things erupted. The guy in front of me turned on a tactical light he had on his gun and lit up the hallway. There were 4 men, 2 with assault rifles and 2 had machetes. Then the contractor said something that scared the shit out of me. He looked at him and said, "You can drop the weapon and leave. I'll walk you out. But if you don't want to walk out, we can carry you out in pieces. Legs, arms, head, hands, and torso." The words flowed out of his mouth like he was ordering coffee from Starbucks. I'm not sure if I caused what happened next, but out of fear, I opened the door to the room in an attempt to get out of the way. Then there were gunshots. I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard gunfire in a closed space like a hallway, but it's loud. Deafeningly loud. But this gunfire was nothing like the gunfire on a boat. It wasn't wild and crazy. It was 2 successive shots, and then there was a pause, and then 2 more, and then 2 more. Inside the room, my ears are ringing so loud that it hurts. When I looked out into the hallway, the 2 men with the rifles were dead, and the other 2 men were on their knees. "What are you about to do?" I asked, and the contractor replied, "Nothing. We just gonna have a talk. Then we're gonna let him go so they can deliver a message to the rest of their friends." One of the men that they had on his knees had very long dreadlocks. They asked him if anyone else was in the building. For some reason, he decided to act hard and pretend that he didn't hear them. That's when they grab a single lock of his hair, ripping it from his skull, causing his scalp to bleed and blood to run down his face as he cried out in pain. Then they ask him again, "Do you have anybody else here with you?" He mumbled, No, there's no one else." They stood both of them up and said, "We're letting you go so you can spread the word that the people in this hotel are protected, and if the rest of your boys come here, they will be killed." The 2 men scrambled away out of the door and down the steps. That was my first and last time checking the east side of the hotel. The following day, the rumor mill was in full steam about the white boys at the Hyatt killing people. That story was spread far and wide, but I was there, and I know the real deal. It was not about black and white. If it was not for those contractors, I would have been dead that night. I was saved from the roof of my house on the 4th day after Katrina hit, placed on a bus and shipped to Nashville, Tennessee, where the wonderful people of that city embraced me. I was given an apartment to stay rent-free for 6 months to allow me time to get back on my feet and start working again. The apartment was extremely nice and nestled along the Cumberland River. This was the first time I'd ever stayed outside of the city of New Orleans for any serious length of time, and definitely the first time I lived among such a diverse group of people. That's the background of my encounter. I'm in Nashville, in the upper-middle-class white neighborhood. What stood out to me was the number of children who played at the park across the street from my apartment. The sound of kids that played was something I was very familiar with, but these kids sounded much more happy than the ones back home. Saturday evenings were always lively. The sounds of kids playing were almost overwhelming, but in a good way. There was a knock at my door. I figured it was the maintenance man who was supposed to come and install a new dishwasher. I opened the door, not thinking or really paying attention, and said, "Hey, come on in." Walking from the door into the kitchen, I got a feeling. You know the feeling you get when your body tells you something is wrong? Hair standing on the back of your neck, chills down your spine, hands trembling. It was worse than that. This was a sensation of fear, primal fear. All of a sudden, one ran high, and everything inside of me said, "Don't turn around." But I had to. I had to look and see what was scanning me like this. Imagine my surprise when I turned to see a little girl at my door. Blue jeans Gap t-shirt. Her head was down and her hair covered her face. For a second, I felt relieved and safe. I said, "Hey darling, you okay?" Now 10 feet away from her, with the front door still open. She raised her head, displaying her face and eyes. Her face was pale, like a pale grayish-white color, and her eyes were black, completely black. What have I just invited into my house? The look of those solid black eyes was like nothing I'd ever seen. As I was thinking to move to slam the door in her face, she smiled, almost as though she could read my mind. She stepped into the apartment, closing the door behind her. This was all too much for my brain to process, and I fainted. When I woke up, I was still on the kitchen floor, and it was dark outside. Initially, I thought it was a dream, but I felt sick. There was a harsh smell in the apartment, like sulfur. I pulled myself off the floor and searched the apartment. Thought to myself, what the fuck? Confused, I decided to take a shower and try to figure out what the hell just happened. The shower didn't help me relax. Actually, my blood felt like it was beginning to boil inside of me even though I was in the shower. My skin had a nauseating odor that reminded me of old pennies. The sickening feeling began to make my body weary, so I decided to call it a night. I was jolted out of my sleep by an unnerving feeling. My eyes were still blurry. I was still a bit disoriented in the darkness of my unlit room. I looked over at a digital clock to see what time it was. I could barely make out the time. 3 a.m. As I tried to gather my bearings, I noticed the black silhouette at the door of my room. Who was it? Was I dreaming? My questions were answered immediately when I made eye contact with the little girl as she approached the foot of my bed. Her eyes like 2 black holes sunk deep into her head. She smiled as she reached out, touching my foot, and then disappeared before my eyes. Since that night, I've been in and out of the hospital with various illnesses. My apartment began to experience strange paranormal activity, things like objects being moved, doors open on their own, and the appearance of the black-eyed girl sitting on the floor watching TV. My most recent diagnosis is necrosis of the foot. Yes, the same foot that she touched. We were on a stage in the Gulf of Mexico on an aircraft carrier when I initially arrived in Louisiana. My job was to escort the priest, Father Michael, into the city, so that he could administer the last rites to the multitudes of dead that were being found in the city of New Orleans. You see, the Archdiocese of New Orleans was completely wiped out, so priests were being flown in from across the United States to help with the deceased and pray for survivors. We took off just before sunrise and headed to New Orleans. As we got closer to the city, Father Michael began to squirm and twist in his seat as if he was uncomfortable inside his own skin. He clutched a silver crucifix in his hand, so hard that his knuckles began to turn white. He then slowly started to mumble, "Take me back. I can't go any further. Take me back." Father Michael quickly reached over one of the soldiers and tried to open the door to the helicopter while we were mid-air. For that, he received an elbow and a chest, accompanied by an evil look. He retreated and sat there between the two armed men with tears in his eyes. Then Father Michael began to break down. "Please turn around. Please turn this helicopter around. Can you feel it?" He stared out of the window as he spoke. "I can feel the evil in this city pulling at my soul. There is darkness here. The devil and his children are deep at work. Take me back, please. There is pure evil here. Please take me back." None of us had ever seen a man of the cloth react in such a way. It was spooky and frightening at the same time. But the priest was serious. So we turned the helicopter around and took him back to the aircraft carrier. After speaking with his boss, the head priest, we all boarded the helicopter again and headed back to the city. The ride back was full of laughs. I must admit we did tease Father Michael a bit. But when we landed, I quickly came to a frightening realization. Everything Father Michael had said was pure truth. The mere thickening and ominous shift in the atmosphere was enough to send goosebumps racing down my skin. The sight was harrowing. Bodies lay strewn, lifeless, painting a macabre scene of devastation. The stuff that was happening in New Orleans was pure evil.